one more thing about Ayer's emotivism, and picking up where we left off at the end of the last video about argument. Um, one of the things that he admits is certainly that we, first of all, okay, the rock bottom position here is that moral propositions are pseudo propositions. They're not real propositions. They're just expressions of feeling. And they don't really have any meaning. But we do engage in, and so moral dispute is not like dispute in, again, mathematics or science or common sense things about the world, like the color of mailboxes. It really is just shouting at each other if we are arguing about values. There's no way for one person to prove that their values are true and that the others are false. But we do engage in disputes, in moral discussions, and moral arguments. And Ayer is on page 4, is admitting that. But what are we really arguing about when we have moral arguments? He says here, for we certainly do engage in disputes, which are ordinarily regarded as disputes about questions of value. But in all such cases, we find, if we consider the matter closely, that the dispute is not really about a question of value, but about a question of fact. When someone disagrees with us about the moral value of a certain action or type of action, we do admittedly resort to argument in order to win him over to our way of thinking. But we do not attempt to show by our arguments that he has the wrong ethical feeling towards a situation whose nature he has correctly apprehended. What we attempt to show is that he is mistaken about the facts of the case. We argue that he has misconceived the agent's motive, or that he has misjudged the effects of the action, or its probable effects in view of the agent's knowledge, or that he has failed to take into account the special circumstances in which the agent was placed. These are all matters of fact, right? Not matters of value. Or else we employ more general arguments about the effects which actions of a certain type tend to produce, or the qualities which are usually manifested in their performance. We do this in the hope that we have only to get our opponents to agree with us about the nature of the empirical facts for him to adopt the same moral attitude towards them as we do. So moral argumentation is really not about morality. It's about facts, when it's sensible, I suppose. And what we're trying to do is to convince our opponent that these facts are true and hope that he or she responds with the same feeling as we do. So Ayer continues and says, and as the people with whom we argue have generally received the same moral education as ourselves and live in the same social order, our expectation is usually justified. That is, what we're trying to do in moral argumentation is to get a common view of the facts and then hope for a common emotional response. And as he says, we often get that because if we share a culture with somebody, share the same general moral education, we probably do have the same moral responses. But it's not always true. He continues and says, but if our opponent happens to have undergone a different process of moral conditioning from ourselves, so that even when he acknowledges all the facts, he still disagrees with us about the moral value of the actions under discussion, then we abandon the attempt to convince him by argument. That is, if somebody else has different emotions, different feeling responses to certain things in the world, and there's no more room for argumentation. I mean, if we, so it's a kind of an interesting theory. We're relying upon people having kind of the same emotional responses and feelings as we do, and then just sort of clarifying the facts, pointing out something about the situation, like say something about somebody's motive. If I say, well, it wasn't wrong for Jim to steal that apple, and you say, well, it was wrong for him to steal that apple, and we can argue about that. I can say, well, Jim hadn't eaten in 3 days and had no money, and then that's just a fact. And if you accept that as a fact, you may say, oh, well, that's different. That is arguing about facts, not arguing about morality, and sort of hoping or relying upon the idea that we have the same emotional responses, let's say, to Jim's hunger. So we can argue, we can have moral arguments, but our moral arguments are really about the facts of the situation and not about the emotions. And if our emotional responses, let's say that when it's pointed out that Jim hasn't eaten in 3 days and has no money, if the person has no emotional response to that, then we just sort of say, well, okay, well, then we have no basis for argumentation. He continues, just to round it off here. He says, we say that it is impossible to argue with him because he has a distorted or undeveloped moral sense, which signifies merely that he employs a different set of values from our own, which is opening up the thing to, I suppose, a kind of a relativism. But I don't think Iyer would call it a relativism, since, in his opinion, we're talking about kind of nonsensical statements to begin with. We feel that our own system of values is superior and therefore speak in such derogatory terms of his, but we cannot bring forward any arguments to show that our system is superior. For our judgment, our judgment that it is so is itself a judgment of value, and accordingly outside the scope of argument. It is because argument fails us when we come to deal with pure questions of value as distinct from questions of fact that we finally resort to mere abuse, which is, really interesting. That is, when argument fails us, then we just sort of say, oh, you've got an undeveloped moral sense, or there's something wrong with you. But that's just abuse, is what he's saying. It's not backed up by any argumentation. So I think it's a coherent theory. And this is an especially important part of it being coherent, is that, well, of course we do have moral arguments, and they're not all nonsensical, but our moral arguments are really just arguments about facts. And to come to any kind of moral consensus that this is right or this is wrong, ultimately we have to have similar emotional responses. And if we don't, then there's just no basis for any kind of rational argument, any kind of consensus.